In the cold boardroom, all eyes turned to the chair at the end of the table. I sat there, silent. I didn't need to say a word. They mistook my silence for weakness, for submission. But they had no idea that in that very moment, I was already crafting a plan for revenge that would later make the entire company tremble at the mention of my name. They thought they'd won. They thought I was broken. How wrong they were. My name is Elena Price, and for 12 years, I've bled for Harrison and Rowe Capital, 34 years old, with a Harvard MBA and a track record that should have made me untouchable. But in the glass towers of downtown Denver, nothing is ever what it seems. Harrison and Rowe Capital isn't just a financial firm. It's a battlefield disguised in Armani suits and polished marble floors. The building pierces the Colorado sky like a monument to ambition. 42 floors of calculated risks and cutthroat decisions. From my corner office on the 38th floor, I used to watch the Rocky Mountains in the distance, their immovable presence a stark contrast to the shifting allegiances within these walls. The company prides itself on being one of the most prestigious investment firms west of the Mississippi. We manage portfolios worth billions, shape markets with a single recommendation, and destroy careers with a whispered rumor. The boardroom on the top floor is where the real power plays happen. A sanctified chamber with floor-to-ceiling windows, a mahogany table that cost more than most people's houses, and leather chairs that have witnessed more betrayals than a Shakespearean tragedy. I remember my first day here, fresh out of business school, eager and naive. Richard Harrison himself had recruited me, said I had the kind of mind that sees angles others miss. For years, I proved him right. I identified market trends before they emerged, structured deals that made the firm hundreds of millions, and mentored junior analysts who now run their own divisions. My analyses were quoted in the Wall Street Journal. My strategies were taught in business schools. But somewhere along the way, the dynamic shifted. Maybe it was when old Harrison retired and Martin Lowell took over as CEO. Maybe it was when I started questioning certain investments that didn't pass the smell test. Or maybe it was simply because I was too good at what I did. And in this world, competence without political maneuvering is a liability. The boardroom meetings became my weekly torture. Every Tuesday at 9 a.m. sharp, the 12 members of the executive board would gather around that imposing table. Martin Lowell at the head, naturally, with his silver hair and cold blue eyes that could freeze hell itself. To his right, James Fitzgerald, the CFO who'd sell his mother for a better quarterly report. To his left, Patricia Vance, the chief legal officer who knew where all the bodies were buried because she'd helped bury most of them. And then there was me, deliberately seated at the far end, as far from the center of power as possible while still being in the room. It wasn't always like this. I used to sit closer to the middle, my voice carrying weight in discussions about market strategy and risk assessment. But over the past 18 months, I'd been gradually pushed to the periphery, my contributions dismissed, my warnings ignored. The atmosphere in those meetings was suffocating. The air conditioning kept the room at a precise 68 degrees, but you could feel the heat of ambition radiating from every participant. Everyone spoke in corporate doublespeak, their words carefully chosen to advance their own agenda while appearing to serve the company's interests. Alliances formed and dissolved between coffee breaks. Knives were sharpened behind congratulatory smiles. I'd learned to read the micro-expressions, the subtle power plays, the way Martin would tap his Mont Blanc pen exactly 3 times before delivering bad news. How Patricia would adjust her pearl necklace when she was about to destroy someone's proposal. The slight narrowing of James's eyes when he sensed weakness. They thought I didn't notice how my projects were being redistributed to other directors, how my team was being slowly cannibalized, how my insights were being repackaged and presented by others. They thought I was too focused on the work itself to see the political machinery grinding against me. They were wrong. I saw everything, I documented everything, and I waited. Because in this sterile corporate ecosystem, patience isn't just a virtue, it's a weapon. And I was about to show them just how sharp that weapon could be. The Tuesday that changed everything started like any other. I arrived at 8:45 a.m. my Starbucks coffee growing cold as I reviewed my presentation one last time. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive restructuring plan for our emerging markets portfolio, a strategy that could save the firm from the bloodbath everyone saw coming in Southeast Asian markets. The boardroom was already half full when I entered. Martin Lowell stood by the windows, his back to the room, performing his usual power play of making everyone wait for his attention. Patricia Vance was whispering something to James Fitzgerald, both of them glancing at me with barely concealed smirks. The tension in the room was thicker than usual, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Ah, Elena," Martin said without turning around. "So glad you could join us." I was 2 minutes early, but pointing that out would be playing into his hands. I took my seat at the far end of the table, arranging my materials with practiced calm. My heart rate was steady. Years of high-stakes negotiations had taught me to control every tell. "Let's begin," Martin announced, finally gracing us with his face. First item, the emerging market situation. "James, I believe you have something to present." My blood turned to ice. James Fitzgerald stood up, pulling out a presentation that looked remarkably familiar. As he began speaking, I realized why. It was my strategy, my analysis, my recommendations. Word for word in some places, with just enough cosmetic changes to provide plausible deniability. "As I've been researching for the past month," James said, his voice dripping with false authority, "I've identified critical vulnerabilities in our Southeast Asian positions that require immediate action." I felt my jaw clench but kept my expression neutral. Around the table, board members nodded appreciatively, murmuring their approval. Patricia Vance actually applauded when James finished outlining the restructuring plan, my restructuring plan. "Brilliant work, James," Martin said, his eyes briefly flickering to me. "This is the kind of forward-thinking leadership we need." "Elena, you've been overseeing that region. How did you miss these obvious warning signs?" The room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned to me, waiting, some genuinely curious, others barely suppressing their delight at my predicament. This was it, the moment they'd orchestrated, public humiliation disguised as professional discourse. "Actually," I began, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "I submitted a nearly identical analysis 3 weeks ago. It seems to have gotten lost in transition." Martin's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Elena, please. If you'd done this level of work, we would have seen it. Perhaps you're confusing wishful thinking with actual contribution. It's concerning that you're trying to claim credit for James's innovation." "I have the email timestamps," I started. "Enough," Patricia interrupted, her manicured hand cutting through the air. "This is embarrassing, Elena. First, you fail to identify these risks. Then you try to hijack James's moment of success. It's unprofessional and, frankly, desperate." The word desperate hung in the air like a slap. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. James had the audacity to offer me a sympathetic look, as if he wasn't the one holding the knife he'd just planted in my back. "Perhaps," Martin continued, his tone patronizing, "you should focus on smaller, more manageable accounts. It's clear the emerging markets portfolio requires someone with fresher perspectives." Someone chuckled. "Davidson from Risk Management." Even the secretary taking minutes looked uncomfortable. This wasn't just about stealing my work anymore. This was about destroying my credibility, my reputation, my entire career at Harrison & Rowe. I had two choices: fight back now and look even more desperate, or stay silent and let them think they'd won. My hands rested flat on the table, perfectly still. I counted my breaths. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. A technique I'd learned during my most challenging negotiations. "Of course," I said finally, my voice calm as a frozen lake. "I apologize for the confusion." Martin's smile was victorious, predatory. "Good. Now, moving on to the next item." The rest of the meeting blurred past. I sat there, silent, while they carved up my responsibilities and redistributed them like vultures over carrion. My Shanghai connections, given to Davidson. The Tokyo hedge fund relationships I'd cultivated for 5 years, reassigned to Patricia's nephew. Fresh out of Wharton. Every word they spoke was another nail in the coffin they thought they were building for my career. But they'd made a critical mistake. They'd pushed too hard, taken too much, been too obvious in their cruelty. And they'd done it all in front of witnesses, some of whom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with me. When the meeting finally ended, I gathered my materials slowly, methodically. Martin walked past me, pausing just long enough to whisper, "Maybe it's time you considered other opportunities." I looked up at him then, really looked at him, and for just a moment, something in my expression must have broken through his arrogance because he actually took a small step back. "Thank you for the feedback, Martin," I said quietly. "I'll take it under advisement." I walked out of that boardroom with my head high, my stride steady. They thought they'd broken me. They thought my silence was surrender. They had no idea what I was capable of when I had nothing left to lose. That night, I sat in my empty apartment, a glass of wine untouched on the coffee table. The Denver skyline glittered through my floor-to-ceiling windows, each light representing someone else's life, someone else's dreams. I'd sacrificed everything for those lights, for my place among them. The irony wasn't lost on me. This luxury apartment in Lodo, with its exposed brick and modern fixtures, was supposed to be a symbol of my success. Instead, it felt like a mausoleum of the life I'd traded away. The walls were decorated with my degrees, my awards, photographs from company retreats, where I'd smiled next to the very people who'd just destroyed me. I picked up a photo from Aspen, 2 winters ago. The executive retreat where I'd saved the firm from a catastrophic investment in a fraudulent clean energy company. In the picture, Martin had his arm around my shoulder, raising a champagne glass. "To Elena," he'd said then, "our secret weapon." Now I was the one he wanted to disarm and discard. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister in Portland. "Haven't heard from you in months. Kids keep asking when Aunt Elena will visit." Months. Had it really been that long? I scrolled through my messages, declined invitations, postponed dinners, canceled plans. All for what? For 12-hour days that turned into 16-hour marathons. For weekend strategy sessions that consumed entire months. For the promise of a partnership that would never come. I thought about Marcus, the man I dated for 2 years before he finally gave up. "You're married to that firm," he'd said the night he left. "And it's not even a good marriage." I'd been angry then, accused him of not understanding ambition. Now, sitting alone with the ghost of my career, I realized he'd seen what I'd been too blind to notice. The sacrifices ran deeper than relationships. I'd missed my father's 70th birthday because of a client emergency that, in retrospect, could have waited. I'd skipped my college roommate's wedding for a conference where my presentation was ultimately canceled. I'd postponed medical checkups, ignored stress symptoms, powered through migraines with coffee and determination. My laptop sat open on the dining table, the Harrison and Row logo screensaver mocking me. 12 years of emails, proposals, analyses, digital proof of my dedication. I opened a folder labeled Achievements and laughed bitterly. Every triumph in there had been slowly stolen, credited to others, or forgotten entirely. But there was another folder, one I'd started keeping 18 months ago when the pattern became undeniable. Insurance, I'd named it. Screenshots of emails where my ideas appeared days later under someone else's name. Recording transcripts from calls where strategies I'd developed were discussed without acknowledgement. Timestamps proving I'd submitted reports that mysteriously vanished from the system. I'd been documenting my own erasure, thinking someday I might need proof. Now I realized proof wasn't enough. The corporate world didn't care about proof, it cared about power. And they'd systematically stripped mine away. The rage that I'd suppressed in the boardroom finally erupted. I threw the wine glass against the wall, watching the red liquid streak down the white paint like blood. The sound of shattering glass was cathartic. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to destroy something bigger, something that mattered. That's when the idea took root. Not in the heat of anger, but in the cold clarity that followed. They'd taken everything from me: my work, my reputation, my sacrifices, my future at the firm. But they'd made one miscalculation. They'd left me with knowledge, intimate knowledge of every skeleton in Harrison and Rowe's closet. I knew about Martin's offshore accounts in the Caymans, the ones he'd bragged about during a drunk confession at the holiday party. I knew about James's creative accounting that made Enron look like a rounding error. I knew about Patricia's affair with Judge Morrison, the one who'd ruled favorably on 3 of our cases. More importantly, I knew the patterns, the vulnerabilities, the weak points in their armor. They'd kept me close enough to be useful, but never close enough to be dangerous. They hadn't realized that observation from the periphery often provides the clearest view. I walked to my home office, a room I'd barely used because I was always at the actual office. The walls were bare except for a single quote I'd framed during my idealistic first year. "Success is the best revenge." I took it down, turned it around. On the back, I wrote a new motto: "Revenge is the best success." My reflection in the window had changed. The woman staring back wasn't the eager analyst who'd walked into Harrison and Rowe 12 years ago. She wasn't even the accomplished director who'd walked into that boardroom this morning. This was someone new, someone forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by cold fury. They wanted me to slink away, to disappear quietly into another firm where I'd start over at the bottom, my reputation sullied by their whispered insinuations. They expected me to accept my defeat gracefully, professionally, like a good corporate soldier. But I was done being good. I was done being professional. And I was definitely done being their soldier. I opened a new document on my laptop and typed a single word: retribution. Below it, I began to outline a plan. Not a hasty, emotional scheme born of wounded pride, but something methodical, calculated, devastating. Something worthy of the strategic mind they'd so foolishly discarded. The city lights continued to twinkle beyond my window, indifferent to my transformation. But I wasn't looking at them anymore. I was looking at my reflection, at the predator I was about to become. Martin Lowell and his cohorts had created their own destroyer. They just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I walked into Harrison and Rowe as if nothing had changed. Same elevator, same security nod, same coffee from the lobby cafe. But everything was different. I wasn't there to work anymore. I was there to study, to map, to hunt. The first rule of warfare: know your enemy better than they know themselves. I already had 12 years of intelligence, but now I needed to weaponize it. Every conversation became reconnaissance. Every meeting was an opportunity to identify pressure points. I started with the easiest targets: the disgruntled, the overlooked, the discarded. Harrison and Rowe had a high turnover rate in the lower ranks, bodies thrown under buses to protect the executives. These people left with severance packages and NDAs. But NDAs couldn't silence private conversations over drinks with a sympathetic former colleague. 3 weeks after the boardroom humiliation, I met Sandra Kim at a bar in Capitol Hill. She'd been Patricia Vance's assistant for 5 years before being abruptly fired for performance issues, code for knowing too much. "Elena Price," she said, nursing her martini. "I heard about what they did to you. The emerging markets presentation." "Word travels," I replied carefully. Sandra laughed bitterly. "Patricia was gloating about it, said you finally learned your place." She paused, studied me. "But you don't look like someone who's learned their place." "What do I look like?" "Like someone planning something." She leaned closer. "And if you are, I have 3 flash drives of emails Patricia thought she deleted. Insurance policy she doesn't know exists." That was my first recruit. Not an alliance born of friendship, but of mutual destruction. Sandra wanted Patricia to burn, and I needed the match. The second was Thomas Chen, a former junior analyst who'd been scapegoated for a failed merger that was actually James Fitzgerald's miscalculation. Thomas was now working at the Denver Post, hungry for a story that would launch his journalism career. "I can't reveal sources," he said when we met at Union Station. "But if documents happen to find their way to me..." Hypothetically speaking, I said, sliding a folder across the table. What would interest you? His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. Proof of insider trading. Just enough to warrant investigation, but not enough to trace back to me. This would be front page. Not yet, I said, pulling the folder back. Timing is everything. My third asset was unexpected. Richard Harrison himself, the retired founder. I'd maintained contact with him, occasional lunches where he'd lament what his company had become under Martin's leadership. He was too principled to act against his successor, but too bitter to protect him. Elena, he said during our coffee meeting at the Brown Palace Hotel, I've been hearing disturbing things about your treatment. The business world is rarely fair. Mr. Harrison. He studied me over his reading glasses. No, but it usually maintains pretenses. Martin's gotten sloppy, arrogant. The board is starting to notice. Which board members? I asked casually. He named 3, all people who'd been neutral in my destruction but might be swayed if the winds changed. If someone were to present compelling evidence of mismanagement, they'd listen. Hypothetically, the old man knew exactly what I was doing, but his plausible deniability remained intact. He slid a business card across the table, a private investigator who specialized in corporate fraud. He owes me a favor. One favor. Use it wisely. The investigator, Marcus Stone, was a former SEC prosecutor who'd gone private. When I met him, he looked like an accountant. Forgettable face, modest suit, the kind of person who could disappear in any corporate environment. Richard Harrison's favor must be significant for you to call, he said. What am I looking for? Everything Martin Lowell and James Fitzgerald don't want found, but I need it documented, verified, unimpeachable. That's expensive work. The favor covers your fee. What I need to know is, can you do it without leaving traces? He smiled then. The first sign of personality. Ms. Price, I've taken down CEOs who thought they were untouchable. Your colleagues are amateurs playing at being criminals. Give me 6 weeks. While Marcus worked his angles, I maintained my facade at the office. I attended meetings where they continued to marginalize me. I submitted reports they ignored. I watched them get comfortable, convinced they'd broken me. But every slight was documented. Every hostile email was forwarded to my personal account. Every discriminatory comment was recorded on my phone, hidden in my pocket. Colorado was a one-party consent state. I could record any conversation I was part of. I also began something more subtle, psychological warfare. I started leaving printed articles about corporate fraud on the break room table. I'd mention casually in meetings how the SEC was increasing investigations into financial firms. I forwarded company-wide articles about whistleblower protections, always with innocent commentary about interesting trends in corporate governance. Martin began showing signs of stress. He snapped at assistants, demanded loyalty oaths in meetings, installed new monitoring software on company computers. Paranoia is a poison that spreads quickly in guilty minds. James Fitzgerald started making mistakes, small ones that I carefully documented. A miscalculation here, a missed deadline there. Without my safety net catching his errors, his incompetence began to show. Patricia Vance was the most interesting to watch. She'd started checking her office for recording devices, changing her passwords daily, speaking in whispers. Sandra's intelligence was particularly useful here. I knew exactly which buttons to push. 4 weeks into my campaign, I sat in my office creating a timeline. Every piece was moving into position. The investigator would deliver his report soon. The journalist was primed for the story. The board members Richard had identified were growing restless. I looked at the organizational chart on my wall, red X's through the names of my targets. It looked like a battle plan because that's exactly what it was. They'd started this war with their ambush in the boardroom. They just hadn't realized I was the kind of enemy who didn't just fight back. I annihilated. The queen was still on the board. But the endgame was approaching, and in chess, a patient queen is the deadliest piece of all. The first strike came on a Thursday morning, precisely 6 weeks after the boardroom humiliation. Thomas from the Denver Post had published his article online at midnight. Harrison and Rowe Capital under scrutiny for questionable trading practices. By the time Martin arrived at the office, the piece had been shared over 10,000 times. I was already at my desk when he stormed past, his face purple with rage. Through the glass walls of his office, I watched him screaming into his phone, probably at our PR team. The article was carefully crafted, enough specific details to be credible, not enough to trigger immediate legal action. It mentioned sources close to the investigation and documents obtained by the Denver Post. The beauty was in what it didn't say. It didn't name Martin directly, but it highlighted trades that everyone in the industry would recognize as his signature moves. It raised questions without making accusations, letting readers draw their own conclusions. By lunch, CNBC had picked up the story. The stock price dropped 3%. Patricia Vance called an emergency meeting that afternoon. "We need to identify the leak," she announced, scanning the room with suspicious eyes. "Someone is feeding information to the press." "It could be anyone," I offered helpfully. "We've had so much turnover lately. Disgruntled former employees, perhaps?" She stared at me for a long moment. "Yes. Former employees. James, I want a list of everyone who's left in the past year." James nodded, but I caught the flash of concern in his eyes. Some of those departures had been his fault, his incompetence covered up by firing subordinates. Now those ghosts were coming back to haunt him. The second strike came a week later, more surgical this time. An anonymous tip to the SEC about irregularities in our emerging markets fund, specifically the strategy James had stolen from me. The delicious irony was that while my plan had been sound, James's execution was flawed. He'd missed crucial hedges, misunderstood key risk factors. The fund was hemorrhaging money, and now regulators were asking why. I watched James sweat through his shirt as federal investigators occupied our conference room. They requested documents, emails, trading records, all of which would show James's name on strategies he couldn't properly explain because he hadn't actually developed them. "Elena," he cornered me by the elevators one evening. "That emerging markets presentation. I need your original analysis." "I thought you said I never submitted one," I replied innocently. "Cut the crap. We both know. Look, I need your help. The SEC is asking questions I can't answer." "Because you don't understand the strategy?" His jaw clenched. "Because the documentation is incomplete. If you help me, I'll make sure you're properly credited going forward." "James," I said softly, stepping closer. "You destroyed my reputation in front of the entire board. You stole my work. And now you want my help?" I smiled. "I'd rather watch you drown." The third strike was personal, Patricia's affair with Judge Morrison. The photos appeared on an anonymous blog dedicated to judicial ethics. Nothing explicit, but enough. Intimate dinners. A weekend at his cabin in Vail. Her car in his driveway at 2 a.m. The blog noted, with interest, the dates of these encounters compared to his favorable rulings on Harrison and Rowe cases. Patricia tried to suppress it, but the internet is immortal. The State Judicial Review Board announced an investigation. 3 of our pending cases were reassigned to different judges. Clients started asking uncomfortable questions about whether their interests had been compromised. But the masterstroke was yet to come. Marcus Stone, the investigator, had found gold. Martin's offshore accounts weren't just tax havens. They were washing money for insider trading, using information from client portfolios to make personal trades ahead of market moves. It was sophisticated, layered through shell companies. But Marcus had unraveled it, thread by thread. I didn't release this immediately. Instead, I let pieces slip strategically. A suspicious transaction flagged to a contact at the Treasury Department. A shell company's registration documents sent to a forensic accounting blogger. Breadcrumbs that led investigators down a path Martin couldn't block because he didn't know where the trail started. The office atmosphere became toxic. Trust evaporated. Every conversation was guarded, every email carefully worded. The executives who'd once moved as a pack began turning on each other, each suspicious that another might be the leak. During one particularly tense board meeting, Davidson from Risk Management actually accused Patricia of being the source. "You're the only one with access to all these documents," he said. "That's rich coming from you." Patricia shot back. "Weren't you investigated by the FBI 2 years ago?" They devoured each other while I sat silently at the end of the table, taking notes like a dutiful employee. Martin watched his kingdom crumble, his eyes darting between his lieutenants as they fought. The financial press smelled blood. Every day brought new speculation about Harrison and Rowe's troubles. Clients began pulling funds. Headhunters started circling our top talent. The vultures had arrived, and they were hungry. One evening, I found Martin alone in his office, staring at his computer screen. The latest article was open. "Harrison and Rowe Capital, a house of cards?" "It's you," he said without looking up. "I don't know how, but it's you." "That's a serious accusation," I replied calmly. "Do you have any proof?" He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "What do you want?" I wanted to be valued for my contributions. I wanted fair treatment. I wanted the partnership I'd earned. I paused. "But that ship has sailed, hasn't it? We can fix this. The board. They'd listen if I recommended you for partnership now." I laughed, genuinely amused. "Martin, you still don't get it. I don't want to be your partner anymore. I don't want to be part of this diseased culture you've created. I just want to watch it burn." His face went pale. "You'll destroy yourself too. You're still an employee here." "Am I?" I pulled out an envelope from my jacket. "This is my resignation letter, effective immediately. I've accepted a position with Carlyle Investment Group. You know them, your biggest competitor." The beauty of my revenge wasn't just in the destruction, it was in the timing. Every blow had been calculated to cause maximum damage while maintaining my plausible deniability. I was leaving Harrison and Rowe as it crumbled, my reputation intact, even enhanced as one of the few executives not touched by scandal. "You planned this," Martin whispered. "No," I said, heading for the door. "You planned this when you decided to make me your enemy. I just executed better." My resignation should have been my exit, but leaving would have meant missing the final act. I stayed in Denver, watching from my new office at Carlyle Investment Group as the dominoes continued to fall. The SEC investigation intensified. Federal agents became permanent fixtures at Harrison and Rowe, occupying an entire floor. James Fitzgerald was called in for questioning 6 times in 2 weeks. Each time he returned looking grayer, more hollow. His wife filed for divorce after their assets were frozen, apparently. She hadn't known about his creative accounting either. Patricia Vance tried to negotiate immunity by offering information about others, but she'd overplayed her hand. The prosecutors already had everything they needed from the breadcrumbs I'd scattered. Her law license was suspended pending investigation. The woman who'd once wielded legal threats like weapons was now defenseless. But Martin fought back harder than expected. He hired the best crisis management firm in the country, launched an internal investigation to find the saboteur, and even brought in a former CIA operative to sweep for surveillance devices. The paranoia reached absurd levels. Employees were polygraphed, personal phones were banned from the building, and all external communications were monitored. The pressure cooker atmosphere triggered a mass exodus. Senior analysts fled to competitors, taking clients with them. The Hong Kong office defected entirely to Goldman Sachs. Every departure was another crack in the foundation. Then Marcus Stone delivered his final report, not to me, but directly to the FBI. The evidence of Martin's insider trading was comprehensive, meticulously documented, irrefutable. But there was something I hadn't known. Martin had been using client funds to cover his personal losses, a federal crime that carried serious prison time. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after that fateful board meeting. I watched from my office window as FBI agents led Martin out of the building in handcuffs. The media had been tipped off. Photographers captured every moment of his perp walk. The silver-haired titan of finance, reduced to a common criminal. That afternoon, The board called an emergency meeting. Richard Harrison came out of retirement to address the crisis. Several board members resigned immediately, distancing themselves from the scandal. Others lawyered up, preparing for the inevitable lawsuits. Davidson from Risk Management tried to take control, positioning himself as the clean executive who could save the firm. But I'd saved the best for last. Through Sandra's intelligence, I'd learned about Davidson's gambling debts and his use of company algorithms for sports betting, a few strategic leaks to the right people, and Davidson was gone within a week. The infrastructure of intimidation and corruption that had protected them for so long became their prison. Every connection was scrutinized, every decision questioned. The regulatory microscope revealed more rot, bribes, kickbacks, market manipulation. It was a cancer that had metastasized throughout the organization. Harrison and Rowe's largest clients pulled out entirely. The pension funds, university endowments, and sovereign wealth funds couldn't afford the reputational risk. Within 6 weeks, assets under management dropped by 60%. The death spiral was irreversible. I received a call from Richard Harrison one evening. "You did this," he said. But there was no accusation in his voice, almost admiration. "They did this to themselves," I replied. "I just made sure everyone could see it. The firm won't survive. 40 years of building, gone. You built something good once. Martin corrupted it. Sometimes the only way to save something is to let it die and build anew." He was quiet for a moment. "Carlyle is lucky to have you. Don't become like them. Elena, don't let the power corrupt you." "Power doesn't corrupt, Mr. Harrison. It reveals." Martin's power revealed his greed. Patricia's revealed her cruelty. Mine revealed my capacity for justice. "Is that what you call this?" "Justice." "What would you call it?" "Revenge," he said simply. Sometimes they're the same thing. The final board meeting at Harrison and Rowe was scheduled for Friday. I couldn't attend, of course, but Sandra was there, taking minutes one last time before the firm dissolved. She texted me updates in real time. "Martin's lawyer is here, claiming entrapment." Patricia just accused James of being the leak. 2 board members just physically fought, security called. They're voting on dissolution. The last message came at 4:47 p.m. "It's over. Harrison and Rowe Capital will cease operations Monday." I stood at my window, looking across downtown Denver toward their building. Soon it would just be another glass tower. The logo removed, the offices empty. The empire that had tried to destroy me was now rubble. My new colleagues at Carlyle didn't know the full story, only that I'd left Harrison and Rowe just before the collapse. They saw me as prescient, lucky, maybe even prophetic. My reputation in the industry had never been stronger, the brilliant analyst who got out just in time. But there was one more piece to play. Thomas from the Denver Post was writing a book about the scandal. He'd interviewed dozens of former employees, investigators, and clients. He called me for a comment. "Ms. Price, you were there for 12 years. You must have seen signs of the corruption. Any thoughts on how it went undetected for so long?" "Sometimes," I said carefully. Organizations become so insulated, so convinced of their own invincibility, that they forget others are watching. They mistake silence for submission, patience for weakness. Harrison and Rowe forgot that every empire falls eventually. The only question is whether it falls from external pressure or internal rot. "Do you think justice was served?" I thought about Martin facing 20 years in prison, James bankrupt and unemployable, Patricia disbarred and disgraced. I thought about the board members scrambling to salvage their reputations, the toxic culture finally exposed and destroyed. "Justice is a process, not an outcome," I said. But yes, I think the process is working. The article would run Sunday, the final nail in Harrison and Rowe's coffin. My name would be mentioned as one of the few executives who emerged with integrity intact, who'd left before the corruption could touch me. They would never know the truth, that their corruption hadn't just touched me. It had transformed me into the instrument of their destruction. And that transformation was complete. The final board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Friday, the same time, Same day of the week as my humiliation. The poetry of it wasn't lost on me. Harrison and Rowe had sent invitations to all senior staff, past and present, to witness the formal dissolution. They called it closure. I called it my coronation. I arrived 15 minutes early, my Bentley purring to a stop in the executive parking space that had once been Martin's. The security guard, old Samuel, who'd worked there for 20 years, just nodded. He knew. They all knew, even if they couldn't prove it. The lobby felt like a mausoleum. The modern art that had once projected power and prosperity now seemed like tombstones for buried ambitions. Employees moved through the space like ghosts, boxes in their arms, careers in ruins. The elevator ride to the top floor was surreal. 3 months ago, I'd made this journey as a victim. Now I returned as something else entirely. Not quite victor, but certainly architect of their demise. The boardroom was packed. Media had been allowed in for the first time in company history. Reporters from the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Bloomberg. Photographers positioned themselves strategically. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a public execution. The remaining board members sat at the familiar mahogany table. But everything else had changed. Martin's chair was empty. A physical reminder of his absence. His nameplate had been removed, leaving a pale rectangle on the wood like a scar. James Fitzgerald was there, flanked by 2 lawyers. He'd lost 30 pounds in 3 months, his suit hanging loose on his frame. His hands shook as he tried to pour water, spilling it on documents that no longer mattered. Patricia Vance sat rigid in her chair, designer sunglasses hiding what I knew were sleepless eyes. Her legal team had abandoned her when the money ran out. She was representing herself now, a fool for a client. Davidson wasn't there. He'd fled to Switzerland the day before his indictment. But others had come, junior executives hoping to salvage something from the wreckage, clients demanding answers, former employees seeking closure or revenge of their own. Richard Harrison stood at the podium, looking every one of his 75 years. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to formally dissolve Harrison and Rowe Capital, effective immediately. A court-appointed administrator began reading the details: asset liquidation, liability settlements, bankruptcy proceedings. The numbers were staggering. $40 billion in assets under management reduced to less than $2 billion. 600 employees reduced to 12, just enough to manage the wind down. Does anyone have questions? The administrator asked. A reporter raised her hand. Is it true that client losses could exceed $500 million? We're still calculating the full impact, the administrator replied. Another reporter. Mr. Fitzgerald, do you have any comment on the criminal charges against you? James's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. No comment. James managed, his voice cracking. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. A young journalist, someone I didn't recognize, stood up. This question is for anyone who can answer it. How did one of the most prestigious firms on Wall Street collapse so completely in just 3 months? Silence fell over the room. Board members looked at each other, each waiting for someone else to speak. Finally, Richard Harrison cleared his throat. Hubris, he said simply. When you believe you're untouchable, you stop watching for threats. When you treat people as disposable, you create enemies. When you mistake fear for respect, you build on foundations of sand. His eyes found me in the crowd, held my gaze for a moment. Sometimes, the greatest danger to an empire isn't the barbarian at the gates. It's the person you've wronged who knows exactly where you're vulnerable. Patricia suddenly stood, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. We all know what happened here. Someone orchestrated this. Someone. Ms. Vance, the administrator interrupted. Unless you have proof of criminal conspiracy, I suggest you remain silent. You're already facing multiple charges. She looked around the room wildly, her composure finally cracking. Elena Price. She did this. Ms. Price resigned before any investigations began. Richard said calmly. She's now a managing director at Carlyle. Her record is spotless. All eyes turned to me. I sat perfectly still, my expression neutral. channeling the same silent composure I'd maintained during my humiliation. The photographer's cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the moment. "I'm just here to pay my respects," I said quietly. Harrison and Row was my home for 12 years. It's tragic to see what it became. Martin's lawyer stood suddenly. "My client wants to make a statement." He pulled out a tablet, Martin's face appearing on the screen from federal detention. He looked broken, aged a decade and 3 months. Orange didn't suit him. "I want to apologize," Martin began, his voice hollow. "To our clients, our employees, our shareholders. I failed in my fiduciary duty. I failed in my leadership. I let ambition and greed corrupt everything Richard Harrison built." He paused, his eyes searching the crowd through the screen. "And I want to apologize to those I wronged personally, those whose contributions I diminished, whose careers I destroyed, whose ideas I stole. You know who you are." The connection ended. The room was silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens and the soft whir of cameras. The administrator continued with procedural matters, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't just about numbers and legal proceedings anymore. It was about the human cost of institutional corruption. As the meeting concluded, people began to file out. Former colleagues avoided eye contact with me, some from shame, others from fear. I remained seated until the room was nearly empty. James approached me on his way out, his lawyers trailing behind. "I hope you're satisfied," he whispered. "Satisfied," I repeated. "James, satisfaction would have been getting credit for my work. This is something else entirely." "What is it then?" I stood, gathering my things with deliberate calm. "Consequences." Patricia was the last to leave, stopping beside my chair. "You destroyed everything." "No, Patricia. You destroyed everything. I just made sure you couldn't hide it anymore." She leaned closer, her voice venomous. "I'll prove it was you. Somehow, someday, I'll prove it." "Good luck with that," I said. "You'll have plenty of time to investigate from prison." Security escorted her out, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown to her incarceration. I was alone in the boardroom now, the same room where they'd tried to break me. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air like ashes from a funeral pyre. I walked to the head of the table, ran my fingers across the wood where Martin's nameplate had been. Then I turned and looked at the chair at the far end, where I'd sat in silence 3 months ago, planning their destruction while they celebrated my humiliation. The circle was complete. The board meeting that began this journey had led to the board meeting that ended it. And through it all, I'd said almost nothing. Because actions, as they were about to learn in their trials, spoke louder than words. I left the boardroom for the last time, my heels echoing through the empty hallways of what was once Harrison and Row Capital. The building would be sold within the month. Another company's name replacing the fallen empires, but that was no longer my concern. Outside, Denver's autumn air was crisp and clean. I stood on the sidewalk where 3 months ago I'd contemplated my future after that devastating meeting. Back then, I'd been a woman scorned, humiliated, discarded. Now, I was something else entirely, not a victim, not even a survivor, but an architect of justice served cold. My phone buzzed with messages, job offers from firms in New York, London, Hong Kong, speaking requests from business schools wanting to hear about ethical leadership in crisis, a book deal from a major publisher. The irony wasn't lost on me. Destroying Harrison and Row had made me more valuable than 12 years of building it ever had. But I declined them all. Carlyle Investment Group had given me everything I needed: respect, authority, and most importantly, distance from the graves I'd helped dig. My new office overlooked the Denver Art Museum, its angular architecture a daily reminder that sometimes you have to break conventional forms to create something meaningful. 6 months later, the trials began. Martin Lowell got 25 years for insider trading, embezzlement, and fraud. The judge called his crimes a fundamental betrayal of fiduciary trust. He'd be 78 when he got out, if he lived that long. James Fitzgerald pleaded guilty to avoid trial. receiving 12 years. His wife took their children and disappeared to her family in Maine. He'd lost everything: money, family, reputation. The golden boy of finance reduced to a cautionary tale. Patricia Vance fought until the end, maintaining her innocence even as evidence mounted. She got 15 years and permanent disbarment. The woman who'd weaponized the law had been destroyed by it. I attended each sentencing, sitting in the back row of the courtroom. Not to gloat, but to witness the completion of what I'd started. Each time, they looked for me in the crowd. Each time, I met their gaze steadily, silently. A year passed. Harrison and Rowe became a case study at Harvard Business School. The collapse of corporate ethics, a post-mortem. I was interviewed for the study. My insights praised for their clarity and professional distance. If the professor suspected my deeper involvement, he never said. Richard Harrison invited me to lunch on the anniversary of the dissolution. We sat at the same table at the Brown Palace, where he'd given me the investigator's card. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About what?" "About what you did. What you had to become to do it." I considered the question. They forced me to choose between being their victim or their reckoning. I chose reckoning. And now? Now I'm just Elena Price, managing director at Carlyle. Good at my job, respected by my peers, compensated fairly for my contributions. That's all you wanted originally. Yes, I said. Funny how much destruction it took to get something so simple. He raised his coffee cup. To justice, however it arrives. To consequences, I corrected, however they're delivered. We never spoke of it again. Today, 3 years later. I stand in my office at Carlyle, looking out at Denver's skyline. The Harrison and Rowe building has been renovated, renamed, repurposed. New companies, new dreams, new ambitions fill its floors. The cycle continues. My assistant knocks. "Ms. Price, the board meeting is in 5 minutes." I nod, gathering my materials. Another board meeting. Another corporate ritual. But this time, I sit at the table as an equal. My voice heard, my contributions valued. Not because I demanded it or fought for it, but because I proved that underestimating me was a fatal mistake. As I enter Carlyle's boardroom, my colleagues greet me with genuine respect. They know my reputation. The brilliant analyst who left Harrison and Rowe just before its collapse, who somehow emerged from the wreckage stronger than before. They respect me, perhaps even fear me a little. But they don't know the truth. They don't know that I was the storm that destroyed Harrison and Rowe. They don't know that behind my professional smile lies someone capable of orchestrating complete institutional destruction. They don't know that the woman taking notes at the end of their table might be the most dangerous person in the room. And that's exactly how I want it. Because the greatest power isn't in the words you speak or the threats you make. It's in the actions you take when everyone assumes you're powerless. It's in the patience to wait for the perfect moment. It's in the intelligence to destroy your enemies so completely that no one can prove you did anything at all. I take my seat at the table, open my portfolio, and prepare to contribute to the discussion. My colleagues begin their presentations. Unaware they sit next to someone who brought down an empire with silence and strategy. The meeting proceeds normally: quarterly projections, market analysis, strategic initiatives. I contribute when appropriate, my insights valued and implemented. This is what I wanted all along: professional respect, fair treatment, recognition for my work. It just took burning down a kingdom to get it. As the meeting concludes, I close my portfolio and stand. One of the board members, an older gentleman who reminds me of Richard Harrison, stops me at the door. "Excellent analysis on the Asian markets. Elena, your experience really shows." "Thank you," I reply. "I learned from the best and the worst." He chuckles, not understanding the full weight of my words. "Well, we're lucky to have you. Can't imagine what Harrison and Rowe was thinking, letting talent like you go." I smile. The same quiet smile I wore in that boardroom 3 years ago, when I sat in silence, planning their destruction. They weren't thinking at all. That was their problem. I walk back to my office, my heels clicking against the marble floor. Not the sound of retreat, but of victory. Complete, total, and absolutely devastating victory. In my desk drawer, locked away, is a single photo from that last board meeting at Harrison and Row, the moment Patricia accused me, when all eyes turned to find me sitting silently, unmoved and unbroken. I keep it as a reminder, not of what they did to me, but of what I was capable of in return. The title of this story says it all. I said nothing in the board meeting, but my actions spoke louder than words. And sometimes, that's the most powerful statement of all. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate revenge and justice served cold. I'm curious to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of workplace retribution, please subscribe to the channel for more stories of revenge, redemption, and the price of underestimating the quiet ones. Share your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed corporate karma in action? What did you think of Elena's calculated revenge? Your stories and perspectives make this community richer. Until next time, remember, silence isn't always submission. Sometimes it's strategy.